There is a shot right at the very end of Gravity Falls, after the last of the credits have run and the town has finally gone quiet, where the camera drifts back into the forest and finds a shape that should not still be there. A triangle, turned to gray stone, one arm reaching out, frozen mid-collapse in the moss and the ferns. Bill Cipher, the thing the whole series had spent 2 years building toward, sitting petrified in the woods where anyone wandering through might stumble across him, and it just leaves him there. It does not tell you what it means. 10 years on from the summer this thing first aired, that image somehow lands harder than it did the night it went out, because the story it belongs to did not fade the way children's cartoons are supposed to. It kept growing. Tonight, we are going back through the whole of it, the whole 10 years, so get comfortable, turn the lights down low, and if you have not subscribed yet, it genuinely helps us keep making these. Let me take you back to the 15th of June 2012, because that is where the clock on all of this starts. That was the night the first episode, the one called Tourist Trapped, went out on the Disney Channel, and if you had been watching that night with no idea what you were looking at, you would have seen something that looked, for the first few minutes, like a fairly ordinary Disney cartoon. Two 12-year-old twins, Dipper and Mabel Pines, packed off to spend their summer in a dusty tourist trap in the Oregon woods with a great uncle they barely know. Bright colors, quick jokes, a talking, scheming old man running a fake museum of oddities called the Mystery Shack. The kind of setup you have seen 100 times. And then, very quietly, Gravity Falls starts handing you things that do not belong in that kind of cartoon. A hidden book with a 6-fingered hand on the cover and a number 3 printed inside it. Gnomes that turn out to be unmistakably sinister. A sense, right from the opening, that the friendly summer surface is sitting on top of something older and colder and much more deliberate than anyone is letting on. That first episode is doing something clever that you only really appreciate looking back from a distance of 10 years. It is teaching you, without saying so, that in this town, every small detail is load-bearing, that the throwaway background gag might be a clue, that the series is quietly making a promise to reward you for paying attention. Most cartoons train you to relax and let the episode wash over you. This one, from minute 1, was training you to lean in. And here is the thing that gets lost when people talk about it now, a decade later, as this beloved and finished object. At the time, nobody knew if it would last. It was a debut series from a creator almost nobody had heard of, dropped into a Disney Channel schedule full of live-action tween sitcoms, and it did not look like anything else on the network. The fact that we can now sit here and talk about it as a complete, self-contained, 2-season mystery with a beginning and a middle and an end is the result of a whole string of decisions and lucky breaks and stubbornness that we will get into tonight. But it started here, on a summer night in 2012, with a book and a shack and a promise that everything means something. 10 years is a strange amount of time for a cartoon. Long enough that the kids who watched it at the right age are adults now, some of them making their own shows. Long enough that the thing has calcified into a genuine classic. And yet short enough that the person who dreamed it up is still out here, still talking about it, still adding to it. That is the story we are following tonight. Not just what Gravity Falls was, but what the 10 years did to it, and what it did to everyone who made it, and everyone who could not stop thinking about it. To understand where it came from, you have to understand the man behind it, because Gravity Falls is one of those rare projects that is almost embarrassingly personal, dressed up as a monster of the week comedy. Alex Hirsch created it, and he built the core of it out of his own childhood. He has a twin sister, Ariel, and the relationship between Dipper and Mabel, the boy who overthinks everything and the girl who feels everything, the anxious planner and the boundless optimist, is drawn directly from the two of them growing up. The summers the twins spend in the story are a heightened, magical version of the summers Hirsch remembers. When you know that, the whole thing tilts slightly under your feet. All the supernatural machinery, the demons and the portals and the ciphers, is scaffolding around a very simple and very fragile thing, which is the memory of being a kid with your sibling in a summer that you did not yet know was going to end. That is the engine underneath everything, and it is why a cartoon about a talking triangle can make grown adults cry. Hirsch trained at the California Institute of the Arts, the animation school that has fed the industry for decades, and he came up alongside a whole cohort of people whose names are going to keep surfacing tonight, because that class turned out to be among the most productive groups of animation creators of their generation. He worked on other shows first, cutting his teeth, before Disney gave him the chance to make his own. And what he brought them was not a normal pitch. He wanted something that was funny and warm and full of jokes, absolutely. But he also wanted it to be a genuine mystery, a serialized puzzle, where the clues were real, where a demon glimpsed for a single frame in the first season would pay off 2 years later, where the audience was treated as clever enough to keep up. That is a hard sell for a children's network, because children's networks historically wanted episodes you could air in any order, self-contained little units that would not confuse a kid tuning in halfway through the run. Hirsch wanted the opposite. He wanted something you had to watch in sequence, that rewarded obsession, that hid things. There is a detail here that I keep coming back to. Hirsch has said in interviews that he does a lot of the voices himself, and that is not a small thing. He is Grunkle Stan, the gravel-voiced con man at the center of the whole family. He is Seuss, the sweet, slow handyman. He is Old Man McGucket, the town lunatic. And he is Bill Cipher, the villain. Sit with that for a second, because it is one of the strangest facts about the whole production, and among the most revealing. The same throat that gives you the warm, exhausted, secretly loving voice of Grunkle Stan also gives you the shrieking, cruel, gleeful voice of the demon that wants to end the world. The hero of the family and the devil of the story come out of the same person. 10 years later, I still find that faintly astonishing, that the emotional anchor and the nightmare were performed by one man, often in the same recording sessions, and that you never once feel the seam. The other thing to understand, and it is the decision everything else hangs on, is that Gravity Falls was built to end. This is the fact people get wrong more than any other, so I want to be careful and clear about it. When it finished after 2 seasons and 40 episodes, an enormous number of fans assumed it had been canceled, that Disney had pulled the plug on something that was still climbing, that the network had killed a hit. That is not what happened. On the 20th of November 2015, while the final stretch of episodes was still airing, Hirsch put out a public statement making it as plain as he possibly could. It was not being canceled. It was being finished. Ending it, he said, was 100% his choice. He had designed the thing from the beginning as a story with a shape, a mystery with a solution, more like a novel than an ongoing series, and he did not want it to sprawl on for 8 seasons, slowly getting worse until the network slowly euthanized it. He wanted it to close while it was still good, at the point the story had always been heading toward. I cannot overstate how unusual that is, and it is the part I want to sit with, because it goes against every instinct of the industry it lived in. A successful children's cartoon is a money machine. It sells toys, it fills a schedule, it prints merchandise, and the pressure to keep it running for as long as the ratings hold is enormous. The finale drew 2.47 million viewers and set an all-time viewership record for Disney XD, the network it had moved to for its 2nd season. This was not a series running out of steam. It was one at its absolute peak, and the person in charge of it chose to walk away, on purpose, because the story was over. 10 years later, that choice looks like the smartest thing anyone involved ever did, because it is the reason we have a clean, complete, rewatchable object, rather than a bloated thing everyone remembers loving in the early years. But at the time, it took real nerve to leave that much money and momentum on the table. Gravity Falls is finite because a person decided it should be, and every conversation about revivals and continuations that we will get into later tonight runs headlong into that original decision. Somebody built this to be a book, not a soap opera, and then he closed the book. So let me lay out the shape of the mystery itself, the thing all those clues were pointing at, because 10 years of fan work has made it easy to forget how carefully it was doled out. The book Dipper finds in the first episode is journal number 3. On the cover is a golden 6-fingered hand, with the number 3 printed in the middle of the palm, and inside it is a lifetime of research into the impossible things living in and around the town. Someone had walked these woods before the twins ever arrived, someone patient and brilliant and increasingly frightened, cataloging gnomes and ghosts and worse, and then they had vanished. For most of the first season, the story simply calls this person the author, and the central question, the real spine of the whole thing under all the Monster of the Week fun, is who wrote the journals and what happened to them. The author is the mystery box. Everything else is decoration on top of that box. What makes the structure so satisfying, looking back, is that the answer was hiding in plain sight the whole time, sitting in the house with the kids. There were 3 journals, not one, and the author had deliberately split them apart and hidden them in separate locations across the town, precisely so that no single person could ever gather all 3 and use them together, because together they were a set of instructions for a machine. That is the slow dawning horror of the first season and the start of the second. The realization that the wonder book Dipper has been treasuring, the field guide to a magical summer, is actually 1/3 of a manual for something the author came to regret with his whole heart. The journals are written in the voice of a man who starts out thrilled by discovery and ends up scrawling warnings to himself, trust no one, and drawing a triangle with one eye and a top hat over and over in the margins. You can watch a mind come apart across the pages. And the genius of releasing a real, physical copy of Journal 3 years later, which we will come back to, is that fans could hold that unraveling in their hands. The author, it turns out, is a man named Stanford Pines, and here we arrive at the emotional machine at the very center of it all, the thing that 10 years later still makes this more than a clever puzzle. Because the great uncle the twins have been living with all summer, the loud, greedy, lovable con man they call Grunkle Stan, is not who he says he is. And the episode that detonates all of it, that takes the mystery box and turns it into a family tragedy, is the one called A Tale of Two Stans, which aired on the 13th of July 2015, deep in the second season. If you want a single episode that explains why this cartoon has the reputation it has, why grown adults treat it with the seriousness usually reserved for prestige drama, that is the one. Here is what that episode reveals, and I am going to lay it out plainly because it is canon, and it is the foundation everything else stands on. Grunkle Stan's real name is not Stanford at all. It is Stanley. He has a twin brother, Stanford, the older of the two, the genius, the actual author of the journals. As boys, in a rundown town on the New Jersey coast, the two of them were inseparable, and Ford was born with a small difference that mattered enormously to how his life went. He had 6 fingers on each hand, 12 in total, a condition called polydactyly, and the other kids mocked him for it, and Stanley was the brother who stood up for him and threw the punches. That physical detail, the 6 fingers, is where the 6-fingered hand on the journal covers comes from. It is not a spooky occult symbol. It is a portrait of Ford's own hand, the thing he was bullied for as a child, printed on the cover of his life's work. And then comes the wound that splits them, and it is heartbreakingly small. Stanley, messing around, accidentally damages the science fair project that was Ford's ticket to a prestigious university, the one shot that was going to lift him out of that dead-end town. Ford does not get in. Their father, furious, throws Stanley out of the house, tells him he is not welcome back until he has made money to match the fortune he supposedly cost the family. And so the two brothers, who had been closer than anyone, are torn apart as teenagers, one launched towards science and greatness and a lonely destiny in the Oregon woods, the other cast out to drift across the country as a small-time crook and con man, sleeping in his car, running scams, carrying the guilt of what he did to his brother the whole time. Every loud, grasping, money-obsessed thing about Grunkle Stan that the first season played for laughs suddenly has a source. He is a man who was told, as a boy, that his worth was measured in the money he owed, and he spent his whole life trying to pay off a debt to a brother who would not speak to him. What Ford did with his greatness is the other half of that episode, and it is the part that turns the family drama into a science fiction tragedy. He settled in Gravity Falls precisely because it was the strangest place he could find, a town sitting on top of an unusual concentration of the impossible, and he devoted years to studying it and filling those journals. But he was not working entirely alone, and he was not working entirely of his own free will. He had help from a college friend, a nervous, brilliant engineer named Fiddleford McGucket, and he had a mentor who turned out to be something far worse than a bad influence. Under guidance he trusted, Ford built a machine beneath his house, an interdimensional portal, a doorway meant to open onto other worlds. He believed he was doing visionary work. By the time he understood what the portal was really for, and who had really been guiding his hand, it was far too late, and the being that had been feeding him the designs was a dream demon who wanted the door opened so that his own kind could pour through into our reality. Terrified, Ford broke with his mentor and tried to shut the whole thing down, and in his desperation, he reached out to the one person he had left, the brother he had not spoken to in a decade. Stanley came, and the reunion went wrong almost immediately, an argument boiling over into a fight, and in the chaos Ford was knocked into the active portal and swallowed by it, thrown into the vast unknown of the multiverse, gone. Stanley was left standing in the basement with his brother's research, his brother's journal, and a machine he did not understand that had just eaten the only family he had. And what he chose to do with the next 30 years of his life is For my money, among the most staggering acts of love in any children's cartoon ever made. He took his brother's name, he took his brother's house, and turned it into the Mystery Shack, a tacky tourist trap, partly to make the money to survive, and partly as cover. And in secret, in the basement, night after night for 3 decades, this con man who was thrown out of school taught himself enough to slowly, painstakingly rebuild and reactivate the portal, to bring his brother home from wherever the machine had thrown him. Every scam he ran up top was funding a rescue mission down below that no one knew about, that he could never explain to anyone, that made him look for 30 years like a selfish old fraud. This is the reveal that reframes the entire first season, and it lands in the episode called Not What He Seems, which aired on the 9th of March 2015, and it is one of the great cliffhangers in the run. For a season and a half, you have watched Grunkle Stan behave suspiciously, sneak around, hide things from the kids, and you have been quietly encouraged to wonder if he is a villain. Not What He Seems pays that off by revealing the portal in the basement and the countdown and the terrible risk, and it ends with the machine roaring to life and a figure stepping out of the light. A man with 6 fingers on each hand, the author, alive, home at last after 30 years lost in the space between worlds. Ford, voiced by J.K. Simmons, whose dry, weathered authority is perfect casting, walks back into the story he had been absent from the whole time, and everything pivots on that moment from a tale of 2 kids and their weird uncle into a tale of 2 broken brothers trying to figure out if there is anything left to save between them. 10 years on, the patience of that construction still impresses me. They made you wait an entire season and a half for a man to walk through a door, and they made the wait feel like the point. We should talk about the demon, because a story is often remembered by its villain, and Gravity Falls has one of the most distinctive villains in modern animation. Bill Cipher is a floating yellow triangle with a single eye, a little top hat, a bow tie, thin black limbs, and a voice pitched somewhere between a game show host and a car alarm. He should be ridiculous, and part of his genius is that he is ridiculous, right up until the moment he is actually terrifying. He speaks in riddles and cheerful threats, he can enter dreams and possess bodies through deals, and he spent 30 years manipulating Ford before he ever crossed paths with the twins. We have gone deep on Bill elsewhere on this channel, on the philosophy he preaches and the tragedy underneath him, so I am not going to walk the whole of that road again tonight. But for the shape of the 10-year story, it matters where he comes from and what he became. On screen, Bill is kept deliberately mysterious. You learn that he is an interdimensional being, that he is far older than the world the twins live in, that he traffics in chaos and calls it freedom, and that he is bound by strange rules. He needs a deal, a handshake sealed in blue flame, before he can take a body or strike a bargain. That rule-bound quality is not just flavor, it is the crack the heroes eventually pry open. But his actual origin, the story of where a creature like that comes from, was something the series only hinted at, and it stayed a gap in the lore for years. The fuller version did not arrive until much later, in the book Hirsch wrote from Bill's own point of view, and because that account is narrated by Bill himself, a proven liar, you have to hold it at arm's length. As Bill tells it, he comes from a flat, 2-dimensional world called Euclidia, a place of sentient shapes that he found unbearable, and he claims he was responsible for its destruction, burning his whole world and everyone in it, including his own parents, an act he reframes to himself as liberation rather than the catastrophe it was. Whether you take that at face value is up to you, since the teller has every reason to lie about it, but it is the closest thing to an origin the canon offers, and it recasts the cheerful little triangle as something that annihilated an entire dimension before he ever floated into Ford's dreams. The thing I keep admiring about Bill, purely as a piece of writing, is that rule about the deal, the handshake sealed in blue flame. A demon who could simply seize anybody he wanted would be boring, an unstoppable force with no handle on him. But a demon who needs your consent, who has to talk you into it, who cannot cross the last inch without you reaching out and shaking his hand, is a far more frightening idea, because it makes every victim complicit in their own ruin. Ford shook that hand. Mabel, in her own way, handed over the rift. The horror of Bill is never that he takes things from you, it is that he gets you to give them to him, and that small rule, invented for a kid's cartoon, is the whole reason he works as a villain. It also happens to be the thing that finally kills him, since the con only lands because he cannot resist a deal. What I find remarkable, from the vantage point of a decade, is how completely Bill escaped the frame. He is one flicker in the first season, a symbol on a page, a background carving, long before he is ever a character. And now he is among the most recognizable original villains animation has produced this century. A fixture of fan art and tattoos and cosplay, a face people who have never seen a single episode can still identify. That does not happen by accident. It happens because the design is clean enough to draw from memory, because the writing gave him lines you cannot forget, and because a triangle was trusted to carry real menace. 10 years later, the merchandise shelves and the ink on people's arms are full of a shape that started as a doodle of paranoia in a scared man's journal. Underneath the demon and the portal, there is a whole layer that is about memory, and it is the layer I think has aged into the most unsettling part of the whole thing. Gravity Falls is, when you look at it directly, a story obsessed with forgetting. There is a device in the town called the memory gun, invented by McGucket, that can erase specific memories from a person's mind. And there is a secret organization called the Society of the Blind Eye that spent years using it on the townspeople, wiping out their memories of every paranormal thing they witnessed, keeping the town ignorant of its own strangeness on purpose. The reason the people of Gravity Falls can live on top of all this weirdness and barely react to it is not that they are dim, it is that someone has been reaching into their heads and taking the weirdness out, over and over, for a long time. The town's innocence is manufactured. That is a properly dark idea to build into a children's cartoon. The notion that peace of mind is something being done to you without your consent. And the cost of that machine is where the series refuses to let memory erasure be a clean, cartoon reset. McGucket, the man who built the memory gun, used it on himself, again and again, to blot out the things he had seen and the guilt he carried from helping Ford build the portal. And it destroyed him. He lost decades of his own life, whole stretches of who he was, and he became the town lunatic, the babbling old man in the junkyard that everyone writes off as harmless and mad. That is the price the story puts on forgetting. It is not a tidy fix, it is brain damage. It is the slow erasure of a person, and the town kook everyone laughs at is a monument to it. When you know that McGucket was once a brilliant engineer and a father, and that his madness is self-inflicted, an attempt to escape memories too heavy to carry, the character stops being comic relief and becomes one of the saddest figures in the whole run. 10 years on, in a culture that talks constantly about wanting to forget the things that hurt us, that thread lands even harder than it did. All of it comes to a head in the finale, and the finale is worth walking through carefully, because how Gravity Falls chose to end is inseparable from why it endures. The endgame is triggered by an object called the Rift, a crack in reality that Bill needs in order to break through into our world. In the episode called Dipper and Mabel vs. the Future, which aired on the 12th of October 2015, something quietly cruel and completely earned happens. Mabel, the sunniest character in the whole series, is falling apart because summer is ending and everything she loves is about to change, and Dipper is being offered a chance to stay in Gravity Falls and apprentice under Ford, which would mean the twins going their separate ways. Bill, wearing the body of a bumbling time traveler, finds Mabel at her lowest and tricks that grief out of her, gets her to hand over the rift, and then shatters it. The apocalypse does not begin because a hero failed to stop a villain. It begins because a 12-year-old girl was sad that her childhood was ending, and someone weaponized that sadness. That is the whole thing in miniature, right there. What follows is Weirdmageddon, the climax that runs across 3 episodes from late October 2015 into the 1-hour finale in February 2016. Bill gains a physical body, tears open the sky, and turns Gravity Falls into a nightmare kingdom of floating madness and roaming monsters and those unblinking eye-bats, with himself enthroned at the top of a great stone pyramid. And here is a piece of world-building that matters more than it first appears. Bill cannot spread beyond the town. There is a barrier at the border of Gravity Falls that he cannot cross without a specific piece of knowledge he does not have, which is why the apocalypse stays local, a weirdness quarantined to one town in Oregon, rather than consuming the earth. That limitation is not a cheat. It is the ground the whole rescue plan is built on, and it is a good example of how the rules were set early and then honored at the finish. Now, the way Bill is actually beaten is the piece I most want people to get right, because it is easy to misremember. A prophecy gets set up over a long stretch, a wheel of 10 symbols, one for each of the main characters, that supposedly has the power to destroy Bill if the 10 people join hands in a circle. Dipper is the pine tree, Mabel the shooting star, Seuss the question mark, Ford the six-fingered hand, and so on. And the wheel had been hidden in the background for years, a genuine long-buried clue. And then, at the crucial moment, the prophecy fails. The circle forms, the power begins to build, and it breaks, because Stan and Ford, the two brothers, cannot stop bickering long enough to hold hands, Ford correcting Stan's grammar, Stan letting go in disgust. The great mystical solution that had been dangled for 2 seasons collapses because of a petty argument between 2 old men who never healed. I love that the ritual fails. It is a refusal to let a magic wheel save the day, insisting instead that the answer has to come from character, from these specific broken people. And it does. The way Bill is finally destroyed is a con, which is perfect, because the man at the center of the family is a con man. Bill has been trying to get the equation that would let him leave the town, and he believes Stan's mind holds a piece of what he needs. Ford offers to let Bill into his own mind, but the brothers pull a switch. Bill enters Stan instead, and once the demon is trapped inside Stan's head, Ford fires the memory gun, erasing Stan's mind and destroying Bill along with it. Bill realizes too late that he has been fooled, that his fatal mistake was messing with this family, and his physical form cracks and shatters, and Stan, in one last moment of the man he is, throws a final punch at the crumbling demon. Weirdmageddon undoes itself, the sky closes, the monsters are pulled back into the void. The world is saved by a trick and a brother's willingness to give up his entire self. Because that memory gun does exactly what it always does, and Stan pays the full price. He wins by forgetting everything, including the 2 children he had come to love more than anything, including his own brother, including himself. The apocalypse ends, and the man who ended it does not know his own name. But he is not left there, and the way he is brought back is the emotional center of the finale, and, I think, one of the most tender sequences the medium has produced. Stan's mind is gone, wiped clean, and the family gathers around him, and it is Mabel who reaches him, with a scrapbook, with the pig, Waddles, with the accumulated small evidence of a summer full of love. Memory here is dangerous, and it is costly, and it does not usually come back, and I said earlier that Stan is the exception, so I want to be honest that this is not how the memory gun normally works. It is a miracle driven entirely by how much these people love him, the emotional weight of the summer literally pulling a person back into existence, and it works precisely because 40 episodes had been spent earning it. He remembers. Slowly, and then all at once, Grunkle Stan comes back to himself, and there is not a person watching who is not undone by it. And then, because it was always honest about the thing underneath all the adventure, it ends the only way it could, with everyone leaving. The twins turn 13, the town throws them a birthday party, and their birthday is also the last day of summer, which is the whole story compressed into a single afternoon, joy and ending folded together so you cannot separate them. Dipper turns down the chance to stay and apprentice with Ford, because he will not leave his sister, and the 2 of them get on the bus and ride home to Piedmont, California, back to their ordinary lives, older than they were, changed in ways they will spend years understanding. The Mystery Shack passes not to Dipper, who loved its secrets, but to Seuss, the handyman, who becomes the new Mr. Mystery, and that is exactly right, because Seuss had been looking for a family and a place his whole life, and the shack was always more his home than anyone's. And Stan and Ford, the 2 brothers torn apart as boys over a broken science project and a debt that never should have been a debt, finally reconcile, and they leave together on a boat called the Stan O. War II, sailing off to explore the strange corners of the world side by side, the way they had dreamed of doing when they were children, with a little boat and a big ocean. 2 old men getting back the adventure that life stole from them at 15. That is the ending, and I want to sit a moment on why it works 10 years later, because a lot of finales are loved in the moment and then curdle when you rewatch them. And this one does the opposite. It gets better. It gets better because it is not really about defeating a demon at all. The demon is the excuse. The real subject is the fact that summers end, that childhood ends, that you cannot stay 12, and you cannot stay in the magic place forever, and that the people you love get old and forget things, and sometimes come back to you, and sometimes do not. It takes the most ordinary and unbearable fact of being alive, that everything good is temporary, and it wraps that fact in gnomes and portals and a triangle, so that a child can hold it without being crushed by it, and so that the same child, grown up and watching again at 22, suddenly understands what they were really being told. That is why people who were the right age in 2012 cannot let it go. It was never about monsters. It was about the summer running out, and now their summers really have run out, and it is still there, saying the thing it always said. So that is the whole arc of it, and if the story had simply ended there, in February 2016, it would still be remembered fondly. But the reason we are talking about 10 years, and not just about a cartoon that ended, is that the story did not stop when the last episode aired. In some ways, the strangest and most interesting part of the whole saga is what happened after the credits rolled for the final time, out in the real world, among the people who could not accept that a mystery this deep had really been fully told. Because here is what was going on the whole time that a casual viewer never even noticed. Every single episode ends with a cryptogram, a string of scrambled letters flashed on the screen during the credits, and every one of them decodes to a real hidden message. This was not decoration. It was a second show running underneath the first, a puzzle layer for the people willing to do the work. And the codes were not random, they followed a progression that itself was a puzzle. The first 6 episodes use a Caesar cipher, where every letter is simply shifted a fixed number of places down the alphabet. Then, from the 7th episode through the 13th, the method switches to the @bash cipher, where the alphabet is reversed so that A becomes Z and B becomes Y. From the 14th through the 19th, it moves to a system fans call A1Z26, where each letter is just replaced by its number in the alphabet. The 20th episode combines methods, and then from the 21st episode all the way to the end, it uses a keyed Vigenère cipher, which is a genuine step up in difficulty, a cipher that needs a secret keyword to crack and that stumped serious codebreakers for years. And it gets better, because you are told which cipher to use if you are paying close enough attention. At the very end of the theme song, under the music, there is a whispered voice, and that whisper is a hint. In the Caesar era, it whispers 3 letters back. In the @bash era, it tells you to switch A with Z. In the number era, it says 26 letters. In the Vigenère era, it points you toward the key. The decryption method is being quietly handed to you in the opening titles of every episode, spoken so low most people never consciously heard it. And if you take that whole theme song and play it backwards, you get a voice, Bill Cipher's voice, hissing that he is watching you, nerds. That is hidden in the theme. It was there from the first episode, aimed directly at exactly the kind of obsessive who would eventually think to reverse the audio. The most devoted fans were anticipated before they even existed, and a message was left waiting for them. And when you decode the credits cryptograms in order, from the first episode to the last, they form a larger meta-message, a little verse that reads, "From the first until the last, search the codes of credits past. 1 means 1, so search them all. Welcome to Gravity Falls." The whole cipher layer is a closed loop that congratulates you for finding it. 10 years later, I still think this is among the most impressive things the production pulled off. Not the existence of the codes, plenty of shows have hidden a cipher or two, but the sheer commitment, 40 episodes of it, escalating in difficulty, worked into the theme and the credits and the background art. A parallel narrative that most of the audience walked right past, and a devoted minority lived inside. The final episode's whisper, fittingly, is not a cipher hint at all. It just says goodbye Gravity Falls. After 40 episodes of teaching you to decode its secrets, the last thing it whispers to you is a plain goodbye. That obsessive puzzle culture spilled off the screen and into the real world in the most spectacular way imaginable. In the summer of 2016, a few months after the finale. If you remember the very last shot, the stone statue of Bill in the forest that I opened with tonight, Hirsch turned that image into a real object and hid it on Earth. He built an actual, physical Bill Cipher statue and buried the location inside a global scavenger hunt he called the Cipher Hunt. He launched it on the 20th of July 2016, and the first clue was not in America at all. It was in St. Petersburg, in Russia, taped to a statue on the other side of the world, which meant fans had to coordinate across countries and continents from the very first step. From there, the trail led through a chain of clues scattered across the globe, through the United States, through Japan, through Russia, each one hidden at a real location that someone physically had to travel to, photograph, and decode in order to reveal the next. What happened next genuinely stunned Hirsch. He had built a hunt he assumed would take a long time, and the fandom cracked it in roughly 2 weeks. By the 2nd of August, the trail led to a forest near Reedsport, Oregon, and there, in the woods where it belonged, fans found the statue, the real Bill Cipher, a weatherproof figure built by the prop master Fawn Davis out of plexiglass, standing in the trees, with an arm outstretched exactly like the final shot. With it was a treasure chest full of messages that could only be read under black light, a final reward for the people who had chased a triangle across the planet. It was a piece of performance art, a director handing his audience a real-world version of the exact puzzle solving they had spent 2 years being trained to do, and them proving they had learned the lesson almost too well. The only sour note came the very next day, when local authorities removed the statue and the treasure because of a dispute over who actually owned the land it had been placed on, which is an almost perfect Gravity Falls ending, the magic object appearing in the forest and then vanishing again over a piece of bureaucratic nonsense. The statue itself, though, did not vanish for good, and its afterlife is its own small piece of the 10-year story. After the land dispute pulled it out of the Oregon forest, the figure found a permanent home, and these days, the real Bill Cipher stands at a roadside attraction called Confusion Hill in Piercy, California, where Hirsch arranged for it to live. It is a genuine pilgrimage site now. Fans drive out to a tourist trap in the redwoods to stand next to a stone triangle from a finished children's cartoon, which, when you say it out loud, sounds absurd, and which is also exactly the kind of thing the world of the show would have invented for itself. A tacky roadside oddity that turns out to hold a piece of something much stranger. The Mystery Shack was a tourist trap hiding a portal to other dimensions, and now the final image sits in a real tourist trap in California, hiding, if nothing else, the memory of the strangest scavenger hunt the internet ever ran. What all of this points to, the ciphers and the hunt and the pilgrimages, is the thing about Gravity Falls that I think genuinely changed how television and its audience relate to each other, which is the way it turned watching into decoding. The fandom that grew up around it was not a passive audience, it was a distributed code-breaking machine, thousands of people pooling screenshots and freeze frames and cipher solutions, catching a single frame of Bill in the first season, noticing the zodiac wheel in the background years before it mattered, arguing over the meaning of symbols that had been planted and then walked away from. And because Hirsch had genuinely hidden real answers in the work, the effort paid off. Fans solved major plot points well ahead of the reveals. They decoded the identity of the author. They cracked the Vigenère ciphers. They mapped the connections between episodes that the casual viewer never saw. Creators and audience were locked in a kind of collaboration, one side hiding, the other seeking, and both taking it completely seriously. 10 years later, that model looks ordinary, because prestige mystery shows now come with a built-in expectation that the internet will pick them apart frame by frame. But a cartoon on a children's network was one of the places that taught the audience to do it, and one of the very few that actually rewarded them for it, instead of just teasing. And this is where the story stops being only about a television show, because once the episodes were done, the ravenous, code-cracking fandom did not disperse. It stayed, and the people who owned the property understood something rare, which is that they had built an audience that wanted more lore, the way some audiences want more merchandise, an audience hungry not for toys but for text, for pages, for answers. So the continuation, when it came, did not come as more episodes. It came as books, real physical books that extended the story sideways into the world. And the first and most important of them was a defictionalized version of the object the whole thing had been about in the first place. In July of 2016, 5 months after the finale, Disney published a real, physical copy of Journal Number 3, the very book Dipper finds in the first episode. Hirsch made it with the supervising producer Rob Renzetti, and it is not a companion guide or a behind-the-scenes cash grab. It is the actual journal, faithfully reproduced, the aged paper and the burned edges and the handwriting and the sketches, hundreds of pages of Ford's research, exactly as it exists inside the story, complete with entries that never appeared and secrets hidden in invisible ink that only show up under a black light. For a fandom that had spent years treating the journals as sacred objects, holding one in your hands was overwhelming, and the market agreed. Journal 3 went to number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list and stayed on that list for something like 47 weeks, which is an extraordinary run for what is, on paper, a tie-in book to a finished cartoon. Think about what that number actually means. Nearly a year on the bestseller list, months after the thing that spawned it had ended, for a prop from that thing made real. That is not the behavior of a normal audience. That is a fandom that wanted to live inside the world so badly they would buy the world's own artifacts. 2 years after that, in 2018, came a second book, a graphic novel called Gravity Falls: Lost Legends, which collected 4 new stories set in the town the series built. It is a gentler, more modest continuation than the journal, 4 tales rather than a grand revelation, filling in corners of the place and its people, rather than rewriting the mythology. And that measured pace is worth noticing, because it tells you something about how Hirsch handled the property after the finale. He did not flood the zone. He did not license a dozen spin-offs and let the world get diluted and cheapened the way so many beloved properties do the moment they stop making new episodes. He released a small number of carefully made things, years apart, each one treated as an event, each one adding to the world without overstaying. In an era where every successful franchise gets strip-mined until there is nothing left, the restraint around Gravity Falls has been one of the quiet reasons it kept its dignity. The books came slowly, and because they came slowly, each one mattered. But the fans knew there was one more mystery the show and the journals had never fully opened. For all the lore, for all the pages of Ford's research, one point of view had never been given a voice, and it was the most compelling and dangerous voice of the whole cast. Nobody had ever told the story from inside the triangle. And in 2024, 8 years after the finale, and right in the window of the 10-year anniversary, that changed, with a book that turned out to be the strangest and most ambitious piece of the entire afterlife. The Book of Bill was announced at the end of 2023 and published on the 23rd of July 2024. And it is exactly what the title promises. A hardcover written by Alex Hirsch from the point of view of Bill Cipher himself, the demon narrating his own story directly to the reader. It is not aimed at little kids. It is a book for the audience that grew up, teenagers and adults, the people who were 12 when the series premiered and are in their 20s now. And it uses that freedom to go places a Disney show never could. Darker, stranger, more openly menacing. Inside it are the things the fandom had wanted for years, Bill's origin told in his own unreliable voice, the lost pages that never made it into Journal 3, riddles and ciphers layered through the text the way they were layered through the episodes, and a running sense that the narrator is trying to manipulate you, the reader, the same way he manipulated Ford, that the book itself is a kind of deal you are making with a demon by turning its pages. And the audience answered the way they had answered every time before, only bigger. The Book of Bill landed on the New York Times bestseller list in the summer of 2024 and stayed on it for months, into the following year. Let that sink in for a moment, because it is genuinely remarkable. Here is a book narrated by the villain of an animated show that had been off the air for 8 years, and it becomes one of the best-selling books in the country, sitting on the bestseller list alongside new novels and celebrity memoirs, carried there entirely by a fandom that had refused to move on. There is almost no parallel for it. Cartoons do not usually produce literary events a decade after they end. That Gravity Falls did, twice, first with the journal and then with the book of the villain, is the clearest possible evidence that this was never a normal show with a normal shelf life. The demand did not decay. If anything, it compounded, because the children who loved it grew into adults with money and patience and a hunger for the thing they loved to be treated as seriously as they always felt it deserved. But the reason the Book of Bill matters to the actual story, and not just to the sales charts, is that it did something the series itself had left deliberately unfinished. It told you what happened to Bill. Remember that in the finale, Bill's physical form is shattered and petrified, turned to that stone statue in the forest, and the ending is careful never to say the words "he is gone forever." The stone body sitting in the woods was always a hook, a suggestion that a being like Bill might not be so easily and permanently erased. And the Book of Bill closes that loop, or rather it reopens it in a fascinating way. In the last moments before Stan's mind is wiped and Bill is destroyed, Bill invokes the axolotl, a mysterious, godlike entity that had been hinted at in the deepest corners of the lore, a cosmic being associated with death and rebirth and second chances. And by invoking it, Bill does not simply die. According to the book, he is given a kind of second chance, and he ends up imprisoned in a place called the Theraprism, which is, of all things, a therapy prison, a facility for broken cosmic beings, where entities like Bill are meant to be rehabilitated, reincarnated, made to actually confront themselves. I find that ending strange and wonderful in equal measure, and a lot of the fine detail of the theraprism reaches us through fan transcription of the book rather than through the show, so the specifics deserve to be held gently. But the broad stroke is canon, and it is startling. The great villain of Gravity Falls, the reality-warping demon who burned his own dimension, is not dead. He is in what amounts to cosmic rehab, forced to sit with himself, which for a creature whose entire personality is the refusal to ever stop and feel anything, is arguably a worse fate than destruction. And Hirsch hid the confirmation of it the way he hides everything, partly behind a puzzle, an encoded secret ending that fans had to decode and reach through a hidden website, so that even the final fate of the villain was something you had to work to uncover, rather than something you were simply told. 8 years after the finale, the answer was still not just handed over. You still had to crack a code to learn the truth. That is the through line of the entire 10 years. From the first credit cipher in 2012 to a hidden web page in 2024. This is a story that never once stopped hiding things, that treated its audience, right to the end, as people clever enough and devoted enough to go looking. So what happened to the people who made this thing, across the 10 years since it ended? Start with Hirsch himself, because his path afterward is more interesting than the usual creator afterlife. He did not immediately launch another giant series of his own, and I think that is a deliberate choice rather than a stumble. Instead, he moved sideways through the industry in a way that let him keep his hands on interesting things without chaining himself to another 5-year grind. He contributed to the stories and the dialogue on some films you would not necessarily connect to him, lending work to Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, though his contribution there went uncredited, and spending time in the early development of the Pokémon Detective Pikachu film before leaving it in pre-production. Those are the kinds of jobs that do not put your name in lights, but do keep you in the room where good things are being made. The more visible thread is his connection to the Owl House, the fantasy series created by Dana Terrace, who had worked on Gravity Falls, and who became Hirsch's partner. He turned up there as a voice actor, playing a couple of that show's most beloved characters, the tiny fuzzy king and the deeply strange housebird Hootie, and lending his creative sense to a production that carried a lot of the same spirit, serialized storytelling, real stakes, a warmth that never tips into sentimentality. And in 2018, he signed a multi-year deal with Netflix, the streaming service, betting that the man who dreamed up Gravity Falls could make them something with the same kind of devoted following. What came out of that deal was an adult animated series called Inside Job, and here things get a little more complicated, because Inside Job is frequently attributed to Hirsch when the actual creator was Shion Takeuchi, a writer who had worked on Gravity Falls and who ran the new show, with Hirsch serving as an executive producer rather than the showrunner. It was a conspiracy comedy set inside a shadowy organization that secretly runs the world, sharp and funny and full of the same dense joke writing and hidden lore instincts that Team was known for, and it built a real audience. And then Netflix canceled it, with the cancellation announced in early January of 2023, despite a previous renewal, a decision that came as part of a broader retreat from ambitious adult animation at the service, and that deeply angered a lot of people who had found in Inside Job something rare. I mention it because it is a useful contrast. Gravity Falls got to end on its own terms, exactly when and how its creator wanted, and that is not the normal experience even for enormously talented people. Inside Job, made by veterans of that same crew, was cut off mid-story by a corporation that changed its mind. The clean, complete shape of Gravity Falls looks, from 10 years out, less like the industry standard and more like a small miracle that had to be fought for. Because here is the larger thing the 10 years revealed. The fact that reframes Gravity Falls from a great show into something closer to a foundational one. That production team, the group Hirsch assembled, and the wider circle he came up with, turned out to be one of the most consequential collections of talent in modern animation. Look at what the alumni went on to make. Dana Terrace created the Owl House, which became a landmark of its own for a new generation. Matt Braley, who directed on Gravity Falls, created Amphibia, another beloved Disney fantasy adventure that ran in the same era. Shion Takeuchi created Inside Job. Mike Rianda, a Gravity Falls writer and storyboard artist, went on to co-write and direct the film The Mitchells vs. the Machines, which became one of the best-reviewed animated features of its year. That is an astonishing hit rate for one show's crew. It is the kind of alumni tree you associate with legendary institutions. And it happened because a cartoon on a children's network in the early 2010s happened to gather, in one place, a group of young people who were about to define the next decade of the medium. I keep coming back to this because it changes what the thing is. Gravity Falls was not just a story that a lot of kids loved. It was a training ground, a place where a whole generation of animation creators learned how to build serialized, mystery-driven, emotionally honest television, and then they scattered and built their own versions of it, and now the fingerprints of that one project are all over the medium. When people talk about a Disney television animation renaissance, about the way children's animation in the 2010s got braver and more serialized and more willing to break your heart, they are describing a movement that Gravity Falls sits very near the source of. 10 years later, its most important legacy might not be its own 40 episodes at all. It might be all the other shows that exist because the people who made those 40 episodes went off and made them. It is worth spending a little time on the voices, too, because a story that lives and dies on its characters lives and dies on the people speaking for them, and the cast assembled here was better than a Disney cartoon had any right to expect. Dipper was voiced by Jason Ritter, who brought exactly the right anxious, earnest, slightly cracking energy to a 12-year-old boy trying to be braver and smarter than he feels, and who has gone on to a long and busy career across television and animation in the years since. Mabel was Kristen Schaal, whose voice is among the most distinctive instruments in comedy. That bright, strange, unpredictable delivery that could swing from pure joy to genuine heartbreak in a single line, and who was already known for her comedy work, and would become even more familiar as the voice of the youngest child on another long-running animated show. The chemistry between those two, the way they actually sound like siblings who love each other and drive each other insane, is a huge part of why the emotional core lands, and neither of them ever played the twins as merely cute. The adults were just as carefully cast. Wendy, the laid-back 15-year-old Mystery Shack cashier and the object of Dipper's hopeless crush, was voiced by Linda Cardellini, an actor with a serious live-action career who gave the character a grounded, easy coolness that made her more than a cartoon crush. And Ford, when he finally stepped through that portal, arrived in the voice of J.K. Simmons, one of the most commanding character actors alive. A man who around the same era won an Academy Award for his work in film, lending the long-lost author a dry, brilliant, faintly wounded gravity that instantly made him feel like he had lived the 30 hard years the story said he had. You do not usually get an Oscar winner walking into a children's cartoon to play the third act reveal, and the fact that this one could attract that level of talent tells you how much respect it had already earned inside the industry by its second season. And then there is Hirsch himself, at the center of the whole vocal ensemble, playing Stan and Seuss and McGucket and Bill and half the odd little townsfolk besides, which means that in a great many scenes you are essentially watching the creator have a conversation with himself in 4 different voices. I said earlier how strange it is that the family's warm heart and the story's cruel villain come out of the same throat, and it is worth adding that this was not a budget-saving trick. It was Hirsch performing the extremes of his own creation, giving the con man he built out of love and the demon he built out of chaos the same fundamental voice underneath the disguises. When people wonder why Stan and Bill sometimes feel like 2 sides of a single coin, a manipulator who loves and a manipulator who only takes, part of the answer is that they were literally the same performance, shaded in opposite directions by the man who dreamed both of them up. There is a melancholy in looking at that cast list 10 years on, the ordinary melancholy of any old production, which is that it was a moment in time that cannot be repeated. Those people gathered in booths across a few years to make 40 episodes, and then dispersed into their own careers, and the specific magic of that ensemble at that moment exists now only in the finished episodes. That is true of every show, but it feels sharper here, because Gravity Falls is so much about exactly that, about a group of people sharing one bright temporary thing before life pulls them in different directions. The cast lived out the story's own theme. They had their one summer together in the recording booth, and then the summer ended, and what is left is the recording. Let me talk about how the wider world actually received all this, because the acclaim was not just a fan phenomenon, it was official and it was substantial. Gravity Falls won 2 Emmy Awards, 3 Annie Awards, which are the animation industry's own honors, and a BAFTA Children's Award over in Britain, which is a serious haul of hardware for any animated series, and an extraordinary one for a show that only ran 2 seasons. On the review aggregator Rotten Tomatoes, both seasons hold a perfect 100%, which almost never happens, and which reflects a genuine critical consensus that the thing was, from start to finish, exceptionally well made. Critics praised the writing, the characters, the voice performances, the animation, and the humor. And unusually for a children's show, they praised it without the usual condescending qualifier of good for a kids' show. It was simply good television that happened to be aimed at children, and the adults who reviewed it and the adults who watched it with their kids knew it. The numbers backed up the praise. In its final year, it was averaging somewhere around 1.8 million viewers an episode, and the finale, as I mentioned, pulled 2.47 million and became the highest-rated telecast in Disney XD history. And underneath all of that sits the theme music by Brad Breek, that eerie, wordless, faintly menacing main title that manages to promise wonder and dread in the same breath, a piece of music so effective that it became inseparable from the identity of the whole thing and got its own vinyl release years later. A great theme does quiet, enormous work, setting the emotional key of an entire series in under a minute, and Gravity Falls has one of the best of its era. There is one more piece of the legacy that matters, and it deserves care because it became a genuine cultural milestone. Among the town's cast of oddballs are two police officers, Sheriff Blubbs and Deputy Durland, played mostly for gentle comedy across the series, a bumbling pair who are almost never apart. After the show ended, Hirsch confirmed that the two of them were, in fact, a couple, and their relationship has been widely cited as an early and significant example of gay representation in Disney animation, arriving at a time when the network was still extremely cautious about any such thing. The specifics of exactly what was shown on screen versus what was confirmed afterward deserve to be stated precisely, because a lot of it lives in that careful gap creators of the era were forced to work within. But the broad point stands, and it matters. Working under a network that placed hard limits on what he could say directly, Hirsch still found ways to build these characters and then, once he was free of those limits, to confirm what they were. And for a lot of young viewers who were figuring out who they were themselves, that confirmation landed with real weight. It is part of a pattern you see across the whole run, a creator pushing against the boundaries of what a Disney cartoon was allowed to be, and finding room in the cracks for something truer than the format was designed to hold. Put all of it together, the awards and the ratings and the representation and the codes and the books, and you start to see why the 10-year anniversary was not a quiet nostalgic footnote but an actual event, something the culture wanted to mark. This was not a show that people remembered warmly and vaguely, the way you remember a cartoon from your childhood whose plot you could not recount. This was a show people had studied, had decoded, had built communities around, had grown up alongside. So when the 10th anniversary of that first summer night in 2012 came around, the people who had been 12 when it started and who were in their 20s by then wanted to hear from the man who had made it. And Hirsch, who had never really stopped tending the thing, gave them exactly the kind of anniversary it deserved. The anniversary itself came in June of 2022, 10 years to the month after Tourist Trapped first aired, and Hirsch marked it in a way that was completely in character, funny and generous and a little subversive. He ran a retrospective on Twitter, spread across 10 days, one for each year, digging back through the making of the show and sharing memories and art and stories from behind the scenes under the banner of 10 years of Gravity Falls. It was the kind of thing that lets a fandom relive the whole run together, a slow public unwrapping of a decade of history. But the piece that really cut through, the moment that told you exactly who Hirsch is and how he felt about the fights he had to fight, was a video he put out in which he read aloud the real notes he had received over the years from Disney's Standards and Practices Department, the internal censors whose job is to police what a children's show is allowed to depict, along with the replies he had sent back. I love that he did this because it pulls back the curtain on the single least glamorous and most constant struggle of making the thing, which was the endless negotiation with a corporation over what was and was not permissible. The notes are the small, absurd, revealing objections of institutional caution, the requests to soften this and cut that and never imply the other thing, and Hirsch's replies are the record of a creator pushing back, arguing, sometimes losing and sometimes winning, fighting line by line for the things that made his show what it was. It plays as comedy, the way he presents it, but underneath the comedy is a real and slightly bruising truth about how much of the artistry we admire in a finished show is actually the residue of arguments the artist barely won. The version of Gravity Falls we have is the version that survived those notes. Some things did not survive them, and part of what the anniversary revealed is the ghost of the show that might have been if the man making it had been given a completely free hand. There was more to the anniversary than the retrospective and the video. There was a 10th anniversary vinyl release of the soundtrack, a physical celebration of Brad Brick's music, put together with the reissue label I Am 8-Bit and Disney's own record arm, the kind of collector's object that only gets made for a fandom devoted enough to buy music from a cartoon a decade after it ended. And hanging over the whole anniversary, then and ever since, was the one question the fandom has never stopped asking, the question that gets a little louder every year, which is whether there will ever be more. And here I have to be honest and careful in equal measure, because this is exactly the kind of thing rumor inflates into false certainty. What is actually true, what has been reported credibly, is that Disney has described itself as being in conversations with Hirsch about the possibility of some kind of revival. That is the real state of things. Conversations. In talks. Nothing more concrete than that. What is not true, what has never been true as of the most reliable reporting, is that any new season, any movie, any streaming continuation has been officially greenlit or announced. There is no Gravity Falls Season 3. There is no confirmed film. It remains, as its creator built it to be, a complete and finished object of 2 seasons and 40 episodes, and everything beyond that lives in books and rumors and conversations that may or may not ever become anything. I think it is important to hold both of those things at once, the genuine possibility that Disney and Hirsch have talked about doing more, and the hard fact that nothing has been promised. Because the temptation, for a fandom this hungry, is to hear conversations and start building cathedrals of expectation on top of them. And if there is one thing the whole 10-year story teaches, it is that this thing has always been most itself when it refuses to give you the easy answer, when it makes you sit in the uncertainty and wonder. The revival question is, fittingly, one more mystery left unsolved. One of the things that keeps a story alive across a decade is not what it answers but what it refuses to answer. And Gravity Falls, for all its love of solvable codes, was remarkably disciplined about leaving certain doors closed on purpose. There is a difference between a mystery it hid an answer to and a mystery it declined to resolve at all, and the second kind is rarer and more valuable. Think about the axolotl, the strange cosmic entity I mentioned earlier, the being Bill invokes at the very end. For years before the Book of Bill filled in a little of it, the axolotl was almost nothing, a name in a poem, a riddle buried so deep in the lore that most viewers never encountered it, a suggestion that above and beyond all the demons and portals, there was some vast benevolent power you would never fully be shown. 2 summers on screen, and it is still sitting on questions like that, questions it deliberately never opened all the way, and that restraint is a big part of why people keep circling back. A mystery box that empties itself completely has nothing left to give you on a rewatch. A mystery box that keeps a few compartments sealed forever stays alive. The same is true of the world beyond the town. Gravity Falls is intensely local, almost claustrophobically so, confined to one small place in Oregon and its immediate weirdness, and yet it constantly gestures at something enormous just past the edges. Ford spent 30 years out in the multiverse, and you are given only glimpses of what he saw out there, fragments, a few sketches, a couple of stories, never the full map. The portal opens onto infinity, and the story has the discipline to only show you the doorway. That, I think, is why the setting never feels small despite being tiny, because you are always aware of the vastness pressing in from outside, the sense that Gravity Falls the town is one lit window in a very large and very dark house. 10 years of fan theorizing has poured into those gaps, and the theories are wonderful, elaborate readings of what the axolotl is and where Ford went and what the symbols mean. But the work itself was wise enough to know that its own silence was worth more than any answer it could have given. It handed the audience the questions and trusted them to keep the questions alive, which is exactly what the audience has done. And here is where I want to turn from the machinery to the people, because after all the ciphers and portals and cosmic entities, the reason this survived 10 years is embarrassingly simple, and it is not the mystery at all. It is a family. Underneath every puzzle, the thing you actually remember, the thing that makes people cry on rewatch, is the Pines family and the specific, complicated love running between 4 of them. 2 12-year-old twins who are so close that neither of them can imagine a life where they are not side by side, and who spend the whole summer inching toward the terrible knowledge that growing up is going to require exactly that. 2 elderly twins who were that close once and lost it, who spent decades apart, one nursing a grudge and the other nursing a rescue, and who get, at the very end, the reconciliation the younger pair is terrified of ever needing. 2 pairs of twins are put in the same house on purpose. the children who are afraid of drifting apart, and the old men who already did, so that each pair is a warning and a promise to the other. That structure is the whole thing, if you strip everything else away. Dipper and Mabel are looking at Stan and Ford and seeing what happens if you let a small wound fester for 50 years. Stan and Ford are looking at Dipper and Mabel and seeing everything they threw away. The demon and the apocalypse are there to force the issue, to raise the stakes high enough that the old men have to finally choose each other or lose everything, and they very nearly fail, because the story is honest enough to know that the ritual to save the world breaks down over the pettiest possible argument between two brothers too proud to hold hands. When people say Gravity Falls is about family, they usually mean it as the soft, generic thing every show claims to be about. But this means something sharper and truer by it. It means that family is the thing that can save you, and the thing you are most likely to destroy through nothing worse than pride and time, and that the difference between the Stan and Ford who reconcile and the Stan and Ford who die estranged is a handful of choices made in the last possible moment. That is a properly adult idea, and 12-year-olds were trusted to receive it, and the 12-year-olds who received it are the adults who cannot stop watching it now. It helps to place it among its peers because Gravity Falls did not appear in a vacuum. It arrived in the middle of what a lot of people now call a golden age of television animation, and understanding what surrounded it sharpens what made it distinct. Over on Cartoon Network in those same years you had Adventure Time, that sprawling, dreamlike epic that started as pure absurd comedy and slowly revealed a melancholy post-apocalyptic world underneath, teaching an entire industry that a kid's cartoon could carry deep lore and real sorrow. You had Steven Universe, Rebecca Sugar's tender, ambitious series about love and identity and growing up. And in 2014 you had Over the Garden Wall, Patrick McHale's small, perfect miniseries, another autumnal story about two brothers lost in a strange wood. These were all in conversation with each other, made by people who often knew each other, all pushing against the old assumption that animation for children had to be simple and episodic and safe. What set Gravity Falls apart in that company was its architecture, its almost novelistic sense of design. Adventure Time discovered its depths gradually, organically, unfolding its mythology over many seasons in a way that felt more like exploration than blueprint. Gravity Falls, by contrast, knew where it was going from very early on. It was engineered as a mystery with a solution, planted with clues that were placed before the audience could possibly understand them, built to be watched twice, once to be surprised, and once to see the machine that produced the surprise. That combination of a warm, episodic surface, a rigorous, serialized mystery underneath, and an entire hidden layer of ciphers beneath even that, was something no other show of the era did in quite the same way. Adventure Time was a world you got lost in. Gravity Falls was a puzzle box you solved. Both are wonderful, but they are different pleasures, and the puzzle box turned out to be extraordinarily good at surviving, because a puzzle invites you back to check your work in a way that an open world does not. There is also the simple matter of length, and I keep returning to it because it is so central to why the thing aged the way it did. Adventure Time ran for around 10 years and hundreds of episodes. Steven Universe ran for years across multiple forms. These are magnificent shows, and their length is part of their ambition, but length is also a risk. It means uneven stretches. It means a shape that only becomes clear in retrospect, and sometimes never fully resolves. Gravity Falls made 40 episodes and stopped. You can watch the entire thing in a couple of long, happy weekends, and when you finish it, there are no weak seasons to apologize for. No long middle where it lost its way. No drawn-out decline. It is short enough to rewatch on a whim, and complete enough to reward the rewatch every time. In an age of endless content, of shows that sprawl across a decade and streaming libraries too vast to ever finish, there is something almost radical about a story that says its piece in 40 half hours, and then closes the book with total confidence. 10 years later, that concision looks less like a limitation and more like the source of its immortality. And that brings me to the strangest and most hopeful part of the whole 10-year story, which is that Gravity Falls is not aging into a nostalgia object for one generation. It is renewing itself. Because it lives on streaming now, permanently available, it keeps finding new 12-year-olds, kids who were not even born when Tourist Trapped first aired, discovering it at exactly the age Dipper and Mabel are in it, having the same summer of the mind that the original audience had a decade ago. Parents who loved it as teenagers are now showing it to their own children. The people who decoded the ciphers in real time are introducing them to kids who get to solve them fresh. A story about the summer of childhood has become a thing that childhood keeps arriving at, over and over, a rite of passage that renews with each new set of viewers who reach the right age. That is what separates a hit from a classic. A hit belongs to the moment it aired. A classic belongs to whoever turns the right age next, forever. There is a particular kind of respect a mystery earns when it turns out to have played fair, and this is where I think Gravity Falls plainly outclasses almost every mystery box story of its era, including some far more famous ones aimed at adults. The great failure mode of the mystery box, the trap that swallowed a lot of celebrated live-action shows, is that the questions are more thrilling than any answer could be, so the writers keep piling on new mysteries and quietly hoping nobody notices they never planned a solution. When the ending finally comes, it feels arbitrary, invented on the way to the finish, a betrayal of the years you spent trusting that it all meant something. Gravity Falls does not do that. When you go back and watch a second time, knowing everything, the astonishing thing is that the answers were all there. The clues were real. The demon glimpsed in a single frame in an early episode pays off. The zodiac wheel that saves, or fails to save, the world was in view long before it mattered. The identity of the author was decodable from evidence already handed to you. Nothing in the ending cheats. That fairness is a moral quality as much as a technical one, and it is rarer than it sounds. It means the creator did the hard thing, which is to figure out the whole solution before laying down the clues, and then to have the discipline to plant them honestly and let the sharpest members of the audience get there ahead of him. It would have been so much easier to fake it, to dangle mysteries and improvise resolutions, and count on charm to carry the gaps. Hirsch did not fake it, and the proof is that the fandom, decoding in real time, kept arriving at the correct answers before the reveals, which can only happen if the answers were truly embedded in the work. When people call it a puzzle box, they sometimes make it sound cold, a clever machine to be admired at a distance. But the fairness of the puzzle is actually an act of respect toward the audience, a refusal to treat them as marks to be strung along. And given that the story is about a con man learning to stop conning the people he loves, there is something fitting in the fact that the work itself never cons you. And speaking of that con man, I do not think you can talk honestly about why this lasted without landing, finally and fully, on Grunkle Stan, because he is the character the whole thing turns on, and he is the one I think about most a decade later. On the surface, he is a joke, a greedy, grumpy, cheapskate old man in a fez running a fake museum and fleecing tourists for their vacation money, played for laughs in the early episodes as the least trustworthy adult in a child's life. And the slow, devastating work done across 2 seasons is to reveal that almost everything you assumed about him was wrong, not because he was secretly noble in some obvious way, but because his flaws and his love turned out to be the same thing. He is greedy because he was thrown out of his home as a boy and told his worth was measured in money. He is guarded and deceptive because he has been running a 30-year secret rescue mission he can never explain. He is a con artist because conning was the only skill the world ever let him keep, and he ends up using it, at the very last, to save the entire world and give up his own mind in the process. What gets me about Stan, and this is the reaction I most want to leave you with about him, is that he is the least conventionally heroic character imaginable, and he performs the single most heroic act in the story, and the two things are never once pretended to be in tension. He is not redeemed by being made nice. He stays cranky and crude and money-minded right to the end. It is just gradually shown that this exact difficult man, with all his flaws intact, was capable of a love so total that he spent 3 decades of his life in a lonely basement working toward the return of a brother who might never forgive him, and then gave up his entire self to a memory gun to save 2 children he met one summer. That is a portrait of love that has nothing to do with being a good or easy person, and I find it far more moving than any clean hero could ever be. Hirsch built Stan out of his own affection for the flawed, exhausting, secretly tender old men of the world, and gave the character his own voice. And the result is that the emotional center of one of the best mystery shows ever made for children is a washed-up con artist you would cross the street to avoid. 10 years later, Grunkle Stan is the reason I would put this up against anything. I have spent a lot of tonight on the big machinery, the demon and the portal and the twins, but a story only feels like a real place if the edges of it are populated, and the town of Gravity Falls is among the most fully inhabited settings in animation, crowded with oddballs who each feel like they have a life that continues when the camera is not on them. There is Wendy, the 15-year-old cashier at the shack, tough and survivalist, daughter of a hulking lumberjack, the older girl Dipper is hopelessly and painfully in love with, in the way 12-year-olds are in love with teenagers who see them as a kid. There is Robbie, the sullen emo teen who is Dipper's rival for her, a character that could have stayed a one-note bully and instead got real, ordinary teenage insecurity. There is Leal Gideon, the terrifying child fake psychic, a tiny showman with an enormous quiff who becomes an early rival to Stan and covets the journals and the shack, a villain played at the scale of a toddler's tantrum, which somehow makes him more unsettling rather than less. And there is Pacifica Northwest, who is maybe the best example of how much care went into people it did not strictly need to develop. She starts as the rich, snobbish rival to Mabel, the mean girl heiress of the town's wealthiest and oldest family, exactly the kind of character a lesser show would leave flat as a foil. And then she gets an episode, The Haunted Mansion Story, that peels her open and shows you the cold, image-obsessed family that made her cool and cruel, and lets her choose, in a small but real way, to be better than the people who raised her. It would have been so easy not to bother. Pacifica is a minor character, but the willingness to grant even a minor antagonist an interior life and a shot at growth is exactly the texture that makes the town feel like a world rather than a set. And it is the kind of thing you only fully appreciate on a rewatch, when you are no longer racing through the plot and can notice how much love went into the corners. At the center of all of them, though, is Seuss. And the fact that Seuss is the one who inherits the mystery shack at the end is the quietest and truest statement made about what family actually is. Seuss is the shack's handyman, a big, gentle, childlike man who never fully grew up and who latched onto Stan and the shack because his own father was absent and he needed somewhere to belong. He is comic relief for most of the run, the lovable slow one, and then the finale hands him the keys to the whole place, makes him the new Mr. Mystery, and you realize you have been told all along that this was his home and these were his people. The shack does not pass to Dipper, the boy who loved its secrets and would have been the obvious storybook choice. It passes to the person who needed it most, the one who had already made it his family long before anyone made it official. That is the show's definition of family in a single decision. Not the ones you are born to, but the ones who take you in. And it hands the literal building over to prove it. And waddles, of course, because I cannot talk about the ensemble without the pig. Mabel wins him at the fair early on, and he becomes hers completely, and in a story full of demons and ciphers, one of the most affecting emotional beats in the entire finale runs partly through a pig, through the simple animal love that helps pull Grunkle Stan's erased mind back from the void. Only this show could make a pig load-bearing in the emotional climax of an apocalypse and have it not feel ridiculous, because 40 episodes had been spent teaching you that the small, silly, ordinary attachments, a pet, a scrapbook, a sweater, are exactly the things that turn out to matter most when everything else is falling apart. The town is full of magic, but the heart of it is always in the unmagical stuff. The summer friendships and the animal you love and the tacky shack you would burn the world down to protect. It is worth spending a little while on the texture of the thing, the mood of it, because underneath the frantic plotting it holds one of the most comforting atmospheres in television. It is a story about summer in the Pacific Northwest, about pine forests and lake water and the long golden light of late afternoon, about a creaky wooden shack full of dust and secrets, about the particular safety of being a kid at the end of a long day with nothing to do but wonder. Even when the plot is racing, the world it takes place in is deeply cozy, all warm lamplight and worn furniture and the sound of crickets, the kind of place that feels like a memory even the first time you see it. There is a reason it can make you homesick for a town that does not exist and a summer you never had. It was engineered in its art and its color and its sound to feel like the best version of childhood remembered from a great distance. Brad Brick's music is a huge part of that, and I mentioned the theme earlier, that wordless, slightly eerie title tune that promises wonder and menace at once. But the score across the whole run does something subtler. It holds this constant low hum of nostalgia and unease together, so that even the gentlest scene has a faint shiver in it, and even the scariest one has a warmth underneath. And that balance, cozy and uncanny at the same time, is the exact emotional weather of the whole series. It is the feeling of telling ghost stories in a tent with people you love, safe and frightened together. And the music never lets you forget either half of that. A lot of shows are either comforting or exciting. Gravity Falls figured out how to be both in the same breath. And that particular blend, the safe adventure, the frightening thing you are protected from, is exactly what makes it so easy to sink into. Which is the strange paradox of it, because make no mistake, this was a story truly willing to frighten you. And this is where I think its real audacity lives, in how much darkness it smuggled past a children's network that was watching it closely. I talked earlier about the standards and practices notes Hirsch had to fight, and you can feel, all through the episodes, the pressure of what was not allowed and the ingenuity of how it found ways to do it anyway. Bill Cipher is a genuine horror creation, a being of pure malevolence who tortures people in their dreams and gleefully describes ending the world, and he is never softened into a Saturday morning villain. There are images in Weirdmageddon of real cosmic dread, people turned to stone and hung as decorations, a sky torn open, a hero trapped and tortured, that would not be out of place in a horror film aimed at adults, rendered in the bright friendly palette of a Disney cartoon, and the collision of those two registers is exactly what makes them land so hard. The show understood something a lot of children's entertainment forgets, which is that kids are not fragile, they are drawn to the dark, they want to be scared in the safe way that teaches them the world has real stakes. It treated its young audience as people who could handle dread, grief, moral complexity, the knowledge that some things do not get fixed and some people do not come back, and some summers really are the last one. And it wrapped all of that in enough warmth and humor and love that the darkness never crushed you. It just seasoned everything, gave the sweetness its weight. That is a very difficult balance to strike, and the fact that it struck it while a corporate censor read every script makes it more impressive rather than less. 10 years later, in a landscape where a lot of children's animation has drifted back toward the safe and the frictionless, the sheer nerve of how dark Gravity Falls was willing to go, and how much it trusted kids to meet it there, looks braver than ever. If you really want to understand how deep the obsessiveness went, look at what it did with its margins, because even the throwaway spaces were treated as places to hide meaning. Beyond the 40 proper episodes, there were shorts, small pieces of extra content like the little segments framed as Dipper's Guide to the Unexplained and Mabel's Guiding Tips, minute-long asides that most tie-in shorts would treat as disposable filler, and even those were seeded with jokes and details and the occasional real clue. The background was a hunting ground. Bill Cipher's symbol is hidden somewhere in a huge number of episodes, tucked into wallpaper and stonework and the corner of a frame, so that once you know to look, the villain is watching you from the scenery long before he ever properly appears. There are wanted posters and newspaper headlines with readable jokes. There are objects on shelves that pay off seasons later. There is a whole visual language of foreshadowing painted into sets that the story never draws your attention to. You might freeze a frame, and you were rewarded when you did. This is where a piece of trivia that a lot of casual fans do not know comes in, and it is a good example of how the secrets lived in the margins rather than the spotlight. Dipper is a nickname. His real name, the name on his birth certificate, is Mason. He is called Dipper because of a birthmark on his forehead shaped like the Big Dipper constellation, which he keeps hidden under his hat, and the mystery of his real name runs as a quiet thread. But the actual reveal that his name is Mason came primarily through supplemental material rather than a big dramatic line in a main episode, through creator answers and the extended universe around it, which is a small, telling choice. Even the protagonist's own name was treated as a secret to be uncovered by the devoted rather than announced to everyone. I love that, because it is the whole philosophy in miniature, the sense that the real rewards are not handed to the casual viewer, but waiting for the person willing to dig. And the digging never really had a bottom, which is the point. The wheel of 10 symbols that was supposed to defeat Bill had been sitting in the background since very early, painted on a mysterious surface, cataloged and puzzled over by fans for a long time before it paid off. The symbols each turned out to correspond to a character, but for ages nobody knew what they meant, only that they clearly meant something, and that certainty that a symbol would never be put on screen for no reason is what kept people staring at freeze frames. It trained a kind of faith in its audience, the belief that every image was intentional, and then it honored that faith often enough that the faith never broke. That is an incredibly hard trick to sustain across 40 episodes, because all it takes is a few meaningless red herrings to teach the audience that the details are not trustworthy, and once that trust is gone, the whole game collapses. Gravity Falls kept the trust. The details were, overwhelmingly, real. 10 years on, this is the aspect that feels most like it belongs to a specific and maybe vanishing moment, because it was built for a certain kind of viewing that the streaming era has partly eroded. It was made for appointment television, for a fandom pooling clues week by week between episodes, for the long, agonizing gaps where all you could do was decode credits and stare at symbols and theorize. A lot of that texture is different now, when a new viewer can simply watch all 40 episodes back to back and never sit in the delicious frustration of waiting. And yet the buried architecture is still there, still rewarding the freeze frame, still hiding Bill in the wallpaper, so that even a kid binging it for the first time today can stumble into the deeper layer and feel the specific thrill of realizing that secrets have been kept from them in plain sight the entire time. The way we watch changed, but the thing that was built to reward close attention still rewards it, whenever anyone chooses to pay it. The thing that has surprised me most across these 10 years is not that people still love it, plenty of shows are loved long after they end. It is that the community around it never went dormant. Fandoms usually follow a predictable arc, a fever of activity while the thing is airing, a long tail of nostalgia afterward, and then a slow fade into fond memory. This one did not fade. It kept making things, year after year, a steady output of art and analysis and music and animation and writing, sustaining an active, creative community for the better part of a decade, with no new episodes to feed it. When the Book of Bill arrived in 2024, it did not have to reawaken a sleeping audience. It landed on one that had stayed wide awake the entire time, which is why it could rocket onto the bestseller list within days. That is the profile of something closer to a permanent cultural fixture than a finished cartoon, and it is worth pausing on how unusual it is for any children's show to hold that kind of grip for that long. Part of the reason, I think, is that the fans were given real work to do, and then the work was left unfinished by design. A community organized around a solvable mystery has a purpose, a shared project, and even after the main puzzles were cracked, there were always more. The deeper riddles, the ambiguous symbols, the questions deliberately left unanswered. And Hirsch fed that appetite with exactly the right rhythm across the decade. Not constantly, which would have exhausted it, but periodically. A journal here, a graphic novel there, a scavenger hunt, an anniversary, a book from the villain's point of view, each one a fresh injection of material to decode and discuss, spaced years apart so that anticipation had room to build. It is a masterclass, honestly, in how to tend a fandom without strip mining it, in how to keep a fire burning by feeding it carefully rather than smothering it in fuel. The property stayed alive because the people who owned it understood the difference between serving an audience and exploiting one. But the deeper reason, the one that goes past strategy, is that the fans grew up alongside the exact thing it is about, and that gave the whole experience an emotional dimension no marketing could manufacture. The kids who were 12 in 2012, the same age as the twins, lived their own version of the central story in real time. They finished their own childhoods. They left their own summers behind. Some of them drifted from siblings the way Dipper and Mabel are terrified of drifting, and some of them reconciled with family the way Stan and Ford do, and some of them lost grandparents and great-uncles who were their own versions of Grunkle Stan. A story about the ache of growing up became a companion to an entire cohort actually growing up, so that rewatching it now is not just nostalgia for a cartoon. It is a way of measuring the distance between who they were when they first saw it and who they have become. It did not change. They did. And when they return to it, it holds up a mirror to that change, which is a far more powerful pull than any cliffhanger. I think that is ultimately why it will not let people go, and why it keeps finding the next generation. Because it is not really an object you consume and finish. It is a marker you return to, a fixed point you can measure your own life against. You watch it at 12, and it is an adventure. You watch it at 20, and it is a warning about the ending you can feel coming. You watch it at 30, and it is Stan and Ford, the old brothers, the reconciliation, and the regret. And you understand for the first time that it was speaking to that part of you all along and simply waiting for you to be old enough to hear it. A story that means something different at every age is not a phase you pass through. It is a companion you keep. 10 years in, that is what Gravity Falls has become. Not a memory of a good summer, but a story that meets you wherever you are and tells you the truth about it. There is a larger argument it has ended up making, almost by accident, just by surviving the decade the way it did, and it is an argument about knowing when to stop. When Gravity Falls ended in 2016, the deliberate choice to conclude a hit at its peak looked like an eccentricity, a creator being precious about his little mystery. 10 years later, it looks like wisdom, because we have watched what happened to so much of the entertainment that did the opposite. We have watched beloved shows dragged on for years past their natural ending, until the thing everyone loved curdled into a thing everyone argued about. We have watched streaming services announce ambitious series and then strangle them after a season or two, cutting off stories in the middle, leaving audiences with expensive fragments that will never be finished. We have watched an entire industry lurch between bloat and cancellation, overextending some stories and murdering others, rarely managing the thing Gravity Falls managed, which is to tell a complete story at the right length and then stop with total confidence. The value of a finished thing has only gone up as finished things have become rarer. In an era where you can start a series with no guarantee it will ever be allowed to reach its ending, a show that begins, develops, climaxes, and resolves, all under the control of the person who imagined it, is close to a luxury item. Gravity Falls is a whole story. It has an ending, and the ending is the one it was always heading toward. And nobody can take that away from it, or dilute it, or leave it hanging, because the man who made it closed the book on purpose while he still held the pen. Every year that passes with more stories left unfinished by the churn of the business, that completeness becomes more precious, and it becomes, in a quiet way, a kind of rebuke to the whole model. Proof that the alternative was always possible if creators had the nerve and networks had the patience. And I think that is part of why it feels so restful, so settled, why it holds up so well when you already know every beat. There is a peace in a completed story that an ongoing one cannot give you. An unfinished series is a low-grade anxiety, a thing that might still disappoint you, a promise not yet kept or broken. Gravity Falls kept its promise years ago. Nothing about it is at risk anymore. You can sink into it the way you sink into a book you have read many times, knowing exactly where it goes, trusting it completely, because the whole shape of it is already there and it already earned every beat. The mystery is solved and the family is saved, and the brothers are reconciled, and the summer, painful as it is, ends the way summers are supposed to, with everyone a little older and a little changed and carried home. There is nothing left to fear in it. That is a rare and comforting quality in any story, and it is the quality of a thing that was allowed to be finished. 10 years from its first summer, that is where Gravity Falls sits, complete and safe and permanent. A closed circle you can walk into any time and trust to hold. It ran for only 2 years on screen, and it has outlasted things that ran for 10, because length was never what made it matter. What made it matter was the care, the fairness, the refusal to cheat its audience, the willingness to be dark and to be kind in the same breath, and above all, the decision to be a whole thing rather than an endless one. The people who made it went off and shaped the medium. The fans who loved it never let it go. And it just sits there, finished, generous, waiting for whoever turns 12 next to find the book on the shelf and open it for the first time. Before we close, I want to give a final word to Mabel. Because of all the characters, she is the one it is bravest with, and the one I think a decade of viewers has come to understand better than they did at the time. On first watch, she is the fun one, the loud, glittery, boundlessly optimistic sister, all sweaters and grappling hooks and enthusiasm, the comic engine next to Dipper's anxious straight man. And it would have been so easy to leave her there, as pure sunshine, the reliable source of energy and jokes. It refuses to. It takes its sweetest, most joyful character and makes her, without ever making her a villain, the reason the apocalypse begins, because her ordinary human terror of growing up and being left behind is exactly the crack the demon reaches through. I am not going to walk back through that scene again. We have already sat with it tonight. But think about the nerve it took to do that to her, to say that the end of the world came not from malice or greed, but from a 12-year-old girl who loved her brother and her summer so much that the thought of losing them made her vulnerable to a lie. That is a remarkably honest thing to say about optimism, and about childhood, and about the people who feel everything at full volume. Mabel's brightness is not shallowness, it is a kind of desperate, generous refusal to let anything end, and that same quality is both her greatest strength and the thing that nearly destroys everything. She is loved without being excused, held responsible without being condemned, and then she is the one who saves Stan at the very end, whose scrapbook and whose love pull him back from the emptiness, so that the character who opened the door to the apocalypse is also the one whose heart closes it. There is a symmetry there that I find deeply beautiful, the idea that the very intensity of feeling that made her a doorway for the villain is also the force strong enough to bring a wiped mind home. She is not punished for feeling too much. she has shown that feeling too much is dangerous and holy at the same time. A lot of people who watched as kids identified with Dipper, the careful, nervous, overthinking one, because that is the character framed as the audience surrogate, the one holding the journal and asking the questions. But coming back to it as adults, a lot of those same people find that Mabel is the one who breaks them, because they understand now what she was afraid of. They know now, from the far side of their own childhoods, that she was right to be scared, that the summer really was ending, that things really do not come back the way they were, that the people you cannot imagine living without will one day be memories. Mabel spends the whole story fighting against the single, unavoidable fact of being alive, and she is allowed, kindly, to win the battle that can be won, saving the people she loves, and made to face, honestly, that she cannot win the war, because summer ends anyway, and the bus still comes. That balance of kindness and honesty, in the treatment of one 12-year-old girl, is the whole thing to me. And that is finally what I keep landing on, 10 years out, about all of it. Gravity Falls is a story that told children the truth. It told them the truth about time, about family, about the fact that the best things are temporary, and the temporariness is exactly what makes them precious. And it told them this gently, wrapped in enough wonder and warmth and humor that they could carry it without being crushed, and then it trusted them to grow into understanding it. It did not condescend, and it did not lie, and it did not overstay. And a decade later, the children it told the truth to are adults who cannot stop being grateful for it, and are handing it now to children of their own. I have talked so much tonight about the sadness and the mystery that I have almost done it a disservice, because I want to be clear about something before we finish, which is that Gravity Falls is, first and last, extremely funny. All the melancholy in the world would not have kept it alive for a decade if it were not also a genuine joy to sit through, and the comedy is the part that retrospectives tend to undersell, because sadness and secrets sound more impressive than jokes. But the jokes are the foundation everything else is built on. It is dense with them. Background gags and quick asides and absurd little runs of dialogue, Grunkle Stan's schemes, Seuss's cheerful non-sequiturs, the sheer strangeness of the town's inhabitants, a whole comic universe operating at full speed underneath the mystery. And crucially, the humor never fights the heart, it protects it. The right to break you in the finale is earned precisely by spending 40 episodes making you laugh, so that when it finally turns serious, you have already fallen in love with these people through their silliness. That is a much harder balance than it looks, and it is the thing a lot of imitators miss when they try to make a show that is both funny and profound. They treat the comedy and the emotion as separate gears, funny scene, then sad scene, clunking between the two. Gravity Falls runs them together, so that the same character who is a running joke is also, when the moment comes, the one who wrecks you, and it never has to abandon its sense of humor to reach its depths. Stan is hilarious right up until he is heartbreaking, and often in the same scene. That integration, the refusal to choose between being a comedy and being a tragedy, is a large part of what makes it feel so much like life, because life does not separate the two either. The funniest people are often the saddest. The lightest moments sit right next to the heaviest, and a story that understands that in its bones feels true in a way a purely sad or purely funny one never could. 10 years later, the jokes still land, which matters more than it sounds, because comedy ages faster than almost anything, and the fact that something this old is still actually funny is its own quiet miracle. I gave Stan a full portrait tonight and Mabel a full portrait, so it is only fair to hold Ford up to the same light for a moment before we finish, because he is the character who completes the argument, and he is the one people find hardest to love. Ford is the genius, the 12-fingered prodigy, the actual author, and the story is careful never to let his brilliance off the hook. Everything terrible that happens traces back, one way or another, to Ford's intelligence uncoupled from his humility. He was the smartest person in every room he ever walked into, and being the smartest made him arrogant, and his arrogance made him certain he could handle a being far older and craftier than himself, and that certainty is the crack the demon poured through. We covered how that partnership went and how it ended, so I will not retrace those steps, but the shape of it matters. Ford's downfall is not stupidity. It is the specific pride of a clever man who cannot imagine being outsmarted, and that is treated as a more dangerous flaw than any amount of Stan's crookedness. That is a startlingly grown-up thing for a children's show to argue, that raw intelligence is not a virtue on its own, that a brilliant mind without wisdom or trust or the willingness to be wrong is a loaded weapon. Ford spends 30 years paying for the assumption that he was too smart to be fooled, hunted through the multiverse by the consequences of his own curiosity, and when he finally comes home, he is not cured of it. He comes back still proud, still convinced he knows best, still ready to correct his brother's grammar at the exact moment the world needs the two of them to simply hold hands, and that unbroken pride is what shatters the ritual that was supposed to save everyone. He is not let off the hook. His genius is real, and it is also the thing that keeps breaking the people around him, and it takes losing almost everything, and watching his crooked, uneducated brother succeed through sheer love where all his intelligence failed, before he begins to soften. And that is the pairing the whole thing is built on. The two Grunkles as two answers to the same question about what actually saves a person. Stan is redeemed by love despite never becoming smart or respectable. Ford is redeemed by humility despite never becoming any less brilliant. One brother has to learn that his intelligence was never the point. The other has to learn that his failures never made him worthless, and they can only finish each other's education by finally forgiving each other. When they sail off together at the end, it is not the genius rescuing the screw-up, or the screw-up being tolerated by the genius. It is two men who each spent a lifetime believing the wrong thing about their own worth, finally standing on the same deck as equals. J.K. Simmons gives Ford exactly the weathered, wounded pride the part needs. A man who has been humbled by the universe but not yet by the person he owes the most to. And watching that last wall come down is as satisfying as anything in the finale. I think Ford is the character its cleverest viewers are being asked to be careful about. And given that the most devoted fans are exactly the kind of clever, obsessive puzzle solvers who would see themselves in a brilliant, misunderstood scientist, that is a pointed and generous warning. Be smart, he says by example, but do not let being smart convince you that you cannot be fooled, or that you do not need anyone, or that your intelligence excuses what it costs the people who love you. 10 years on, in a culture that worships cleverness and rewards the confident know-it-all, that warning has only sharpened. The show made its genius its cautionary tale, and then loved him anyway, and let him come home. So that is the whole of it, the 10 years, the making and the meaning, and the afterlife of a cartoon about two kids and a summer, and a book with a hand on the cover. It began on a June night in 2012, looking like an ordinary Disney show, and it turned out to be a finite, fair, funny, frightening, heartbroken masterpiece about the fact that everything good comes to an end, made by a man who then had the wisdom to end it, and loved by an audience that grew up alongside its every theme and never once let it go. The demon is stone in the forest and imprisoned in a cosmic therapy, the twins are grown, the shack belongs to Seuss, the brothers are somewhere out on the ocean, and the whole thing sits complete on a shelf, waiting. If you have made it this far and you are still awake, thank you for spending this time in Gravity Falls with me. There is something fitting about drifting off to a story that was always, underneath everything, about the end of a summer and the sweetness of a thing you know you have to leave behind. That ache of the last golden day, the knowledge that you cannot stay, the love that survives the leaving anyway, is exactly the feeling it was built to give you, and it is not a bad feeling to fall asleep inside of. A decade on, Gravity Falls has settled into the